Hello, my name's Jill Blumenthal and I'm a ranger here at Mesa Verde National Park, standing in the iconic site of Mesa Verde called Cliff Palace. This is the largest and undoubtedly the most famous cliff dwelling here at Mesa Verde, and it is a really amazing place with an amazing story behind it. Cliff Palace is, along with Longhouse, the largest cliff dwelling in the park, and all total there are about 150 rooms here and about 21 of the round underground rooms that we call Kivas. Like all of the cliff dwellings here at Mesa Verde, Cliff Palace would have been built during the 1200s. We see a few earlier rooms here that might date to the 1100s. And keep in mind that this is after people had lived on the mesa tops for something like 600 years before they really began to build intensively in the alcoves. That, of course, leads to a huge question, is why move off of the mesa tops and down into these alcove sites? And there are several possible reasons for that. Some people think that part of the issue might have been water. There was a long 50-year drought during the 1100s that probably caused people a great deal of stress, particularly for drinking water sources. And many of the alcoves do have a seep spring that is associated with them. Cliff Palace has a bit of a seep spring toward the other end of the site, and just around the corner up the canyon there's a pretty reliable seep spring. So some people feel that access to water would have been a good reason to move into the cliffs. I think that it's obvious in a building like Cliff Palace that the building, and of course the occupants of the building, would have been nicely protected from the elements as well. So when it's hard rain or snow or hot sun, people who might have been in some of the courtyard spaces throughout the whole village would have been protected from those elements. And it would have been really a nice, comfortable place. Also the wind, which is at times of the year here really intense. People postulate that perhaps people moved off the mesa tops to allow for the farmland that's on the mesa tops to be used for farming rather than for architecture. And I've heard some Pueblo people talk about returning back into the earth from which they came. And so I think that there may be some symbolism even in moving below the rim and into the cliffs. When people made the decision to move their Pueblo buildings from the mesa tops down into the alcoves, the architecture of the building didn't really change all that much. So people were still building most of the same types of rooms. They're building kivas, they're building rooms which are for storage, they're building some other kinds of rooms that might have had fireplaces in them that are residential rooms. And one of the features that we see in Cliff Palace that we also see in some mesa top sites is the round tower in the center of the structure. So the architecture does not change a lot. The typical unit that seems to have probably been a group of people, a family or a clan unit, perhaps was a kiva and several rooms around that kiva that were used by some sort of a family or social group. In those 150 rooms, we only find about 25 rooms that have fireplaces. So that gives you some sense of the scale here and how many of these rooms might have been used for storage rather than as living space. It's interesting to note that it's only about a quarter of the size of some of the villages that were down in the valleys near here. So if we go west from here down into the Montezuma Valley, there are several fairly well-known pueblos, one called Sand Canyon, one called Goodman Point Pueblo, and those pueblos had perhaps 500 plus rooms and over 100 kivas. So they were much, much larger villages that were contemporaneous time-wise with places like Cliff Palace. It's also interesting to note that in a place like Cliff Palace, this building was built and occupied for really less than 100 years. And so people moved their villages off the mesa tops, built in the alcoves, and then for reasons that we don't fully understand, they decided to migrate away from here sometime in the late 1200s or right around 1300. And they did not come back and live here again. So it's interesting that while we see these places as the hallmark of places like Mesa Verde and the hallmark of Ancestral Pueblo culture, they were built and lived in and depopulated in a relatively short period of time. Like other pueblos here in Mesa Verde, Cliff Palace was built with three fairly simple materials. They took sandstone and shaped it into blocks They held those sandstone blocks together with mud mortar, and where they needed to build a rooftop or a second-story room, a kiva roof perhaps, or perhaps even a balcony, people used wood. And you can see a nice row of timbers behind me. Archaeologists love old wood for a number of reasons, but the primary reason is that they're able to get tree ring dates or dendrochronology dates from those old logs. The logs behind me are in their original location, and if you look at the ends of them, you can see that they're kind of beat up. They're not a clean cut like a modern axe or a saw. They were actually cut with a stone axe. And that particular row of logs has been dated by archaeologists. They take a hollow core drill into the piece of wood, and pull out a core sample. And that core sample shows the cross-section of tree rings that allow for cross-dating and allow for a date to be obtained from those logs. You can see also in those logs that those cores were taken out and left a hole in that place, so they put silicone corks into those spaces. In the early days of tree ring dating, they used a fairly large core drill, and these are actually pretty big plugs. As time went on, they realized that they didn't really need to quite have such a large drill bit, and the corks got quite a bit smaller. Mesa Verde was one of the places where tree ring dating was sort of invented, as the folks that were working on building a chronology found samples from different sites in the Southwest. Mesa Verde was an important place to gather samples because there's so many cliff dwellings with well-preserved wood. And that well-preserved wood helped to build the entire chronology that's used for going back from modern times to, I believe, a couple of hundred years BC. Tree ring dates also tell us a little bit about building construction history. So when we look at the actual construction and when we have places where there's original wood, we can look and decide which parts of the building were built in what order. And we can also see when the last dates are from a building and know that the building was probably not occupied for a long period after that. The latest dates that we see anywhere in Mesa Verde National Park are right around 1280. And it appears that it was soon after that that folks began to move away from this area and move southward into what's now Arizona and New Mexico, and continue to live as Pueblo people in other locations. One of the really prominent features here in Cliff Palace is this round tower that's roughly in the center of the site. And it's a really nice example of beautiful Pueblo architecture and stonework. Folks built towers in many different places throughout the park, both in mesa top villages and in the cliff dwellings. So when people were building mesa top villages and had towers as part of them in the Pueblo II and Pueblo III time periods, when they began to build in the alcoves, they brought the towers down here with them. And that leads again to some very interesting questions about the purpose of towers. It looks stunning, it's very visually appealing, but the question, of course, is why build it? How was it used? Towers do not seem to have any kind of residential features in them. We've not really found items in towers that suggest that they were for storage of any particular thing. And so many people feel that they probably were for observation. But when I look at the tower here in Cliff Palace and wonder what can you observe from this tower that you can't also observe from other places within the site? Across the canyon from us is a place called Sun Temple that seems to have been a place that might have been a special purpose building. It might have been used in some ways for astronomical observations. Whatever it was used for, I guess I look at it and say, well, if nothing else, it was visually stunning. I'm sitting at the edge of what's now an open kiva here in Cliff Palace. And long ago, when folks were living in places like Cliff Palace and other Pueblo buildings, the kivas, of course, would have been covered up. So in addition to having an underground room that we call a kiva, there would have been a courtyard on top of this. So both of those would have been usable spaces where people spent a great deal of their time. Kivas in Mesa Verde have some variation, but the one that we're looking at right here would be a typical Mesa Verde kiva. They are generally circular. They have 6 of these support columns called pilasters, which were what held up the roof beams. And the roofs were constructed in a really ingenious way. They built the pilasters up the walls, and the wooden logs that connected each of the pilasters to each other would connect the pilasters, and then a second set of logs would connect those beams to each other. The next set of logs would connect those beams to each other, and they kept moving toward the center until they were able to build a rooftop that was somewhat domed and somewhat shaped almost like a basket. In the center of that framework, they left an opening, and that was going to become the doorway. And the edges of the kiva were filled with rubble and brought up to level, so that instead of having a domed roof, the whole courtyard ended up being a completely flat surface that again was usable space. I mentioned the doorway in the center of that kiva roof, and from that doorway there would have been a ladder that extended down into the kiva, and that was the primary entrance and exit from the kiva. So people would climb from the courtyard down the ladder to enter the kiva and back up the ladder to come out of the kiva. And that opening in the center of the roof functioned in another way too that was very important. It was how the smoke would get out of the kiva. Down in the center of the kiva, you can see a circular fire pit or hearth. And when people built fires in that fire pit, the smoke would simply rise and go up and out the doorway. What's ingenious about kivas is that not only do they allow the smoke to vent out, they had an actual structural component that allowed for fresh air to come in. So over on the edge of a kiva, there was an opening called a vent that brought fresh air down the wall into the kiva at an opening down at the bottom. And then this is very clever. Instead of that fresh air blowing straight into the fire pit, a short wall or sometimes a slab was placed there, and that was called the deflector, and that prevented that fresh air from blowing directly into the fire pit. So fresh air is coming in, smoke is venting out, and because of the fact that kivas are underground spaces, they probably would have been very, very well insulated. There's long been a debate about the specific use of kivas, and I think that there's a lot of questions about how kivas might have been used here in ancient times, and especially with how kivas are used today in contemporary pueblos. In pueblos today, kivas are typically thought of as buildings that are used in special ways, oftentimes for religious purposes, and only used by certain people for certain kinds of activities. Kivas are generally not a living space for anybody in modern times. However, when you look at kivas in places like Mesa Verde from long ago, they always have a fireplace, and a number of things have been found in kivas that look like they might have been just everyday use, simply household items, things like grinding stones and cooking pots, tool making supplies, things that don't necessarily look like they were for special activities. And so some people feel that kivas might have been a primary residential place during the times that people were in pueblo buildings in the 11 and 1200s in places like Mesa Verde. Other people will look at kivas and look at the fact that they often are plastered with elaborate designs. They have little wall niches in the sides that sometimes special items have been found in those wall niches, and they feel that these may have been used for ceremonies. As with many things, I'm not sure that it's either or. I think that it likely is both. I think that oftentimes people in our culture tend to separate religious activities from everyday activities. And in the Pueblo world, religion and daily life are not separate at all. They're very much intertwined. So many of the things that you do each day, if you're planting corn, if you're gathering plants, you're also saying prayers that are associated with those activities. So I sometimes think it's not necessarily that it was either ceremonial or residential. Perhaps it was both. The other feature that we can see in the floor of this kiva is a small opening that has been stabilized with a piece of a clay pot. And that small opening is not really a structural feature. It's much more of a symbol, or some people would describe it as a religious symbol. Pueblo people refer to that as the sipapu, or some Pueblos will call it the shpap. And it is connected to many of the Pueblos' origin stories, which have a lot of variations, but most of the Pueblos believe that humans came from within the earth, and that we came up through several worlds before we entered up into the world that we currently live in. And many of the Pueblo people believe that we came up into this world through an opening in the earth called the sipapu. As we come out of Cliff Palace, we're climbing steps that were put in the early days of the park, but they go right almost on top of and adjacent to the old trail, which was used by the folks who lived in Cliff Palace and perhaps neighboring communities. This is a little portion of what we call a hand and toe hold trail. And hand and toe hold trails were used really only in places where there was enough of a cliff face that needed to have assistance to get up and down it. Many places have natural cracks or cavities in the cliffs, and people just use those. And visitors all the time ask, gosh, how did people get up and down these cliffs? How did they move through this landscape? And, you know, if you think about someone who's growing up on the edge of a cliff and who has never seen a sidewalk and definitely never seen a road or a car, cliffs are not a barrier at all. When this is the landscape that you learn to walk in, and you've learned from the time that you're very young to move up and down uneven landscapes and vertical landscapes, it wouldn't have been a problem at all.